Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. This week, we are looking at the God's eye view. Is it possible to have an objective view? That is a big, way up idea that in which we have no emotion, nothing gets in the way of actually seeing what is. I'm reminded of an Emily Dickinson poem. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. So when do we know we're seeing, however, and when do we need that microscope? That's a very good question. How do we know when we see? Are we seeing the tree, or are we seeing our interpretation of the tree? Are we in objective or subjective reality, or more likely, some kind of combination of both of those? I talked yesterday a little bit about John Rawls, the classic book on liberal justice, A Theory of Justice, in which he talks about the fact that we can't actually get at a non-subjective view, but we've got to try if we want to be just. We've got to take lots and lots of things into account as we go through these things, and then we have to somehow pull all of those disparate elements together, and through what he calls a veil of ignorance to what he calls an original position. And that position would be one that is actually looking at the greatest fairness for the greatest number, although he's not a utilitarian. I also mentioned yesterday a classic essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, by Richard Hofstadter, an American historian. It appeared in Harper's Magazine in November of 1964. Hofstadter is most famous for that essay and his book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, a book that, just like its title, says that, you know what, all through American history, Americans have not been all that interested in book learning. In the 1964 essay, he talks about the paranoid style, which he describes as the sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy. And these are the things then that get in the way of working toward an objective understanding of what's actually going on out there. As we go through this, do try to remember that this was written in 1964. The situation that he was dealing with and talking about that time was the rise of Goldwater Republicans. But it sort of stays consistent through time. Hofstadter says there are consistent elements in the paranoid style. One is that capitalism is being undermined. Another is that top government officials are complicit in that plot. And the whole apparatus of education, religion, the press, and the mass media is engaged in a common effort to paralyze the resistance of loyal Americans. Yeah, that's from 1964, but he's going to say that's also true in 1830. And as we will see, it's also true long after Mr. Hofstadter has left us. Just a couple of things to show a little bit from the 50s era. Americans don't patronize Reds. You can drive the Reds out of television, radio, and Hollywood. And this track will tell you how to get the Reds out of your living room. A little comic from the time, the communist conspiracy is real, and calling it a witch hunt, red herring, or that they're seeing things, well, that is just what the communists want you to say. This is back to 1964 and the essay. Studying the millennial sects of Europe from the 11th to the 16th century, Norman Cohn believed he found a persistent psychic complex that corresponds broadly with what I have been considering, a style made up of certain preoccupations and fantasies. The megalomanian maniac view of oneself as the elect, a wholly good, abominably persecuted, yet assured of ultimate triumph, the attribution of gigantic and demonic powers to the adversary, the refusal to accept the ineluctable, limitations and imperfections of human existence, such as transience, dissension, conflict, fallibility, whether intellectual or moral, the obsession with inevitable prophecies, systematized misinterpretations, always gross and often grotesque. I'll pop back just a minute. This is an illustration from Europe in which we have this rather lustful looking priest in the confessional. Yes, he turns into a wolf with the poor sheep of the woman confessing. Do notice that the crucifix is a little bit twisted there. This is the view of what Protestants are thinking is happening in the Catholic Church. And in this one, we have some good Protestants having been burned at the stake and tortured by those mean Catholics as the priests look on approvingly. Again, this is the paranoid style, and it's been there for a very long time. We have it here in the U.S. Is this tomorrow? There's no question mark there. America under communism. Well, from the Hofstadter essay again, 1964, he gives us the example of the Jesuit threat in America in the 1830s. The Jesuits are prowling about in parts of the United States, said news reports of the time, in every possible disguise, expressly to ascertain the advantageous situations and modes to disseminate popery. A minister of the gospel from Ohio has informed us that he discovered one carrying on his devices in his congregation. And he says that the Western country swarms with them under the name of puppet showmen, dancing masters, music teachers, peddlers of images and ornaments, barrel organ players, and similar practitioners. And again, very clearly part of the paranoid style. I know a guy who actually knew a guy who saw this, very typical of the time. And I did put in a picture of a barrel organ player just so that you can beware of these very nefarious characters and watch out for one. Going on. But this is Hofstadter again. But respectable paranoid literature not only starts from certain moral commitments that can indeed be justified, but also carefully and all but obsessively accumulates evidence. The difference between this evidence and that commonly employed by others is that it seems less a means of entering into a normal political controversy as of warding off the profane intrusion of the secular political world. The paranoid seems to have little expectation of actually convincing a hostile world, but he can accumulate evidence in order to protect his cherished convictions from it. And this is from, again, the Protestant fears in mid-19th century America. We have this cardinal trying to force these good Protestant children to go to a church school that would obviously indoctrinate them into European ideas and Catholicism instead of going to this nice secular school over here. You can see that the little boy being forced to take his slate into that is hopping mad, just like any good Protestant would be. And this is the propaganda of that time period. But Hofstadter says it's always the same. We've got the good, God-fearing American being forced by some kind of nefarious powers to do something that they don't want to do. The higher paranoid scholarship, says Hofstadter, is nothing if not coherent. In fact, the paranoid mind is far more coherent than the real world. It is nothing if not scholarly in technique. McCarthy's 96-page pamphlet, McCarthyism, contains no less than 313 footnote references. You can look them all up. And Mr. Welch's incredible assault on Eisenhower, the politician, has 100 pages of bibliography and notes. The entire right-wing movement of our time is a parade of experts, study groups, monographs, footnotes, and bibliographies. We don't probably know about Mr. Welch much anymore. Remember, this essay is from 1964. Robert Welch was the founder of the John Birch Society. He made his fortune selling sugar daddies. He was part of the Welch Candy Company back in the day. Very well known in the not in the 40s into the 50s, but still very much a force in the 1960s. We ought to look at some of his quotes. You can get these memes and put them on your Twitter feed if you so choose. All alone in a committee room of the Senate office building in Washington, I was reading the dry typewritten pages in an unpublished report of an almost forgotten congregational committee hearing. Now, notice the paranoid style at work here. Number one, Mr. Welsh establishes that he is not like us. He does indeed have access to power. There he was in the Senate office building. He was reading some typewritten pages, unpublished, kind of dry, almost forgotten from a committee hearing. Oh, and what is he going to see? Oh, yes. Nefarious anti-capitalist, anti-American activity. Of course, that's the way these work. This is another one, and it was under Wilson. That's Woodrow Wilson, the first Democratic president in a very long time, right? And it was under Wilson that the first great propaganda slogan was coined and emblazoned everywhere to make Americans start thinking favorably of democracies and forget that we had a republic. Again, it's that Wilson and those Democrats who are telling us we have a democracy. We do not. The people do not rule. And it was under Wilson, of course, that the first huge parts of the Marxist program, such as the progressive income tax, were incorporated into the American system. Yes, that is a clear road to communism anytime you have a tax. And here's another. In the best days of our republic, notice he's going to harp on that, Americans were fiercely proud of the fact that rich and poor met on such equal terms in so many ways and without the slightest trace of hostility. That's because the poor knew their place in those days, unlike today when they are indeed getting uppity. So again, let's make America great. This is very typical, again, of the paranoid style. Some truth to these things. Yes, there was a progressive income tax that started during Wilson's presidency, had been building for a while, but the details are really, they don't matter in this way of thinking. And so that's a quick look from 1964 of the paranoid style in American politics and the way we sometimes maybe take a little bit of objective reality and suddenly put it into a very subjective framework. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen who see, says Emily Dickinson, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Of course, Emily will point out the fact that how do we know we are seeing? Is it faith or do we need that microscope? Thanks for joining us today. This evening, keep living with J. Exodus Hooper, our affiliated humanist clergy. That's at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time tonight. And his guest is going to be Mandisa Thomas, the founder of Black Nonbelievers. Mandisa has spoken at FUS a couple of times, big supporter of FUS, and we are a big supporter of her and her work and Black Nonbelievers. You will really enjoy what she has to say this evening. On Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, I'll be talking in Bibles and Beer, our humanist Bible study, about Paul's Apocalypse. This is not actually in the scriptures, it's apocryphal, but it is one of the books that is very revealing of the American evangelical way of thinking about how the end of the world and heaven and hell works. Thanks a lot for joining in today. We'll be back tomorrow to talk some more about how do we get that God's eye objective view. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you tomorrow.